World War II spilled blood across the Atlantic and Pacific. The Allies took prisoners on the way to victory. Thousands of German POWs wound up in Virginia, housed in Hampton Roads. It's a little-known chapter of our history through the lens. They were enemy combatants, but they made contributions to Virginia. Hi, I'm Tom Schaad. This is History Through the Lens. During World War II, Virginia housed some 17,000 German POWs, many of them right here in Hampton Roads. And here to join me now to talk about this phenomenon, Julie Spivey, a historian who did a lot of research and a lot of work in Virginia Beach in that area. As a matter of fact, her work led to a historical marker along Virginia Beach Boulevard. If you're driving by a certain area there by a furniture store, you will see a marker for Camp Ashby. Julie, thank you for joining me today on History Through the Lens. I smile because a lot of people still don't know about this legacy of German POWs housed here. How did these guys wind up in Virginia during World War II?
Thank you for having me on the show. A lot of them were captured in the African campaign and brought to Virginia Beach. They were shipped over and were housed at some of the camps in Virginia. And that's how they ended up here.
Well, they had some camps. They had one, of course, in Virginia Beach, which was probably the biggest one in Hampton Roads. That was Camp Ashby. Camp Edinger was an oyster on the Eastern Shore. And I remember going up there and talking to some folks doing a story there. But I know you know a lot about Camp Ashby. Can you tell me about that one?
So Camp Ashby was originally built as a tuberculosis hospital in 1937. And the way that ended up closing down as they found out that that being in the swamp area was not good for tuberculosis patients. So they closed it as a tuberculosis hospital in 1941. And during that time, the government leased the building for $335 a year.
Wow.
And the 3rd Battalion actually came in and resided on the property and built the housing for the POW camp until they were reassigned elsewhere. 3rd Battalion, I don't know if you know, it was for shore patrol.
Mm-hmm.
And when the government felt like we were no longer had threats on the coast, they reassigned the 3rd Battalion, and then that's when they turned it into a POW camp.
I know that on the Eastern Shore, they used to have places where they would be watching the shore and the bay, and for U-boats.
Yes,
there's a legacy there.
They also did blackouts.
Mm-hmm.
I'd spoken to many residents that remember being children, and their parents would have them come in the house and they would hang black sheets and black blankets or whatever dark fabric they had in their house over the windows. So they would do blackouts at a certain time, and they would patrol the shores to make sure that there was no imminent threat.
So can you describe what one of these camps may have been like? We get the impression of a prisoner of war camp, and we see things in movies from Europe, from, like, let's say, what the Germans would have done. What comes to mind is Stalag 17 or something. Was it comparable to that, or is it much different?
So from the research that I've done, it was a lot different. The German prisoners had housing that was built by the government.
Mm-hmm.
They had wash facilities, kitchens, sports areas where they could play sports. They had churches, they had libraries. They basically had all the amenities of the modern day in the 1940s.
Wow.
So there was barbed wire, there was fencing, but as far as what they had available to them, it was relatively, for a prisoner of war camp, it was relatively up to standards. of everyday living.
So they were also a part of the American workforce for a while, right? Because we had so many
They were.
men serving overseas.
They were. That was one of the things that the government was most concerned about was when all of our men went off to war, how were we going to keep going? We had to have people in the fields. We had to have people in the plants. And this was a solution for them. We're going to have prisoners of war. So why not put them to good use? And so what they found is they would bring them over here, house them, feed them, clothe them, provide medical care for them, and they worked. It worked. They built our roads, they built our sewer systems, they kept our farms going, they assisted in our plants. I do know that they were not allowed to work on anything military related.
Mm-hmm.
So any plants that were turned into artillery factories or anything like that, they were not allowed to have any kind of access to that.
And I remember, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I remember talking to a gentleman last year who still remembers them as a 10-year-old boy. He was out in Virginia Beach in the Pungo area, and he recalls that they would come by in trucks, and they had guards with long guns, and they were watched very, very closely. And I think they were paid about half of what the American wage earner would get doing that particular job. Am I correct?
Correct.
That is his
correct.
recollection.
That is correct. They were paid wages to do that, and they could use those wages in several ways.
They were able to save that money or to send it back to their family, or
so there were several things that they did with it. They used it for canteen money. They could buy cigarettes and sodas. They could send it back to their families. Mm-hmm. And they also could save it. I think there was a number put out a couple of years ago about the staggering amount of money paid out after these guys were released as POWs in the United States. Mm-hmm. And they were allowed to take those funds back to Germany with them.
I know we have some photos here. If we can probably pull up a couple of those about some of these prisoners of war that we saw coming to. Yeah, I'm looking at a photo right now. I'm not sure if this is Camp Ashby. Or,
it is.
It is. I haven't seen that one before.
Yes, that is a Camp Ashby prisoner. One of the gentlemen in that photo would be Max P.O.W.
Who is Max P.O.W.?
Max P.O.W. was a prisoner of Camp Ashby. He was actually caught in France. Mm-hmm. He was in a foxhole, and he was caught by, that would be Max. He was caught by some American soldiers, and he was brought over to Camp Ashby and worked and lived at Camp Ashby for a couple of years.
Wow.
I found out about Max through his grandson. His grandson contacted me and asked me if I could find out any information about his grandfather. And sure enough, I went to the POW rosters, and Mr. P.O.W. was on those rosters.
Wow, that's something else. We're going to hold that thought for a moment, because we're going to talk more about some individual stories when we come back on this edition of History Through the Lens. Welcome back on this edition of History Through the Lens. I'm Tom Schaad with historian Julie Spivey. We're talking about POWs in Hampton Roads and Virginia, the ones that came from Germany, folks, in 1944-45. Just an incredible legacy that a lot of people don't realize here in Virginia. And just before we get into some individual stories, a lot of these guys, your research shows, came from North Africa and fought under the Silver Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And a lot of people know who that is.
Yes.
These are pretty elite guys.
Yes. They were the elite force in the North African campaign. Erwin Rommel was definitely a man to be feared in battle. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we captured his troops was quite the triumph. We were in Africa fighting over the Panama Canal, the waterways there. Whoever controlled that controlled the war, because that's where the supplies came in and out. So the fact that we were able to defeat Rommel was definitely a triumph.
And a lot of those guys ended up in Virginia Beach, along with those captured on D-Day. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Wow, that is something. Let's see some more pictures of some of these prisoners. Now, that's a new one that you sent me recently, Julie. Where's this from?
That is actually Max Pohl in his uniform. That is him in his German uniform.
With the arrow there on the far right.
Yes, sir.
Wow. So was that just after he was captured?
This is before.
Oh,
this is
okay.
right before. This was a picture that was taken before he went into war.
And we don't know a whole lot about Max except his military record. He was captured, and anything else you can tell us about Max?
Yeah, I can definitely give you some information. Max was actually born on July 9th, 1907. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1943. He was actually 37 years old when he was captured. I don't know exactly what task he was doing while he was imprisoned at Camp Ashby, but I do know from his grandson that Max actually had a hernia while he was in the camp, and the doctors there took very, very good care of him. He was a carpenter before he went into the military, and he was caught in France. He was in a foxhole with another soldier, and when the Americans happened upon them, the other soldier was going to open fire on our soldiers, and Max pushed his gun down and said, "Please don't." And so the American soldiers took him out of the foxhole and arrested them, and then the process started, and that's how he ended up in Camp Ashby.
So he pushed the gun away from his fellow soldiers, you mean?
Yes.
Wow.
He was trying to keep his fellow soldier from opening fire on the Americans.
And why do you think he did that, according to his grandson?
I think he was afraid. He was afraid of dying, to be honest with you. He had a wife and children at home, and he wanted to go back home. He wanted to just make it back home. So according to his grandson, and what his grandson has told me, is that he wanted to thank us as Americans for taking care of his grandfather. He was very happy. He said, as a descendant of this man, he was very grateful that the American soldiers captured him and brought him to the States.
I think it's incredible when you look at the legacy of the POW camps and what they were meant to do here in America. It was more, if I'm taking a leap, just correct me, please, but was it more about trying to rehab some of these guys? Because we knew the war was going to end, and sooner or later, we're all going to be working together again.
It was. They were brought over here definitely for a purpose, but I think it became a greater purpose once they were here. Teaching them the democratic way of life, and how the United States operates, and what we believe in, and things of that nature. And from the gentlemen that I have researched, and the grandchildren of some of these POWs, it was a very good experience for them.
Something you rarely hear about, going to a POW camp held by an enemy. You actually had a good experience. Were they surprised at how the Americans treated them at that time?
Yes. Are you referring to the POWs or their grandchildren?
Actually, both, for that matter.
Okay.
I mean, first the POWs, yes.
Yes, they were. They were taught to be afraid of Americans. They were taught that if they were captured, they would be killed. They would be tortured. They, would be put in prison camps and worked to death and things of that nature. And what they actually found when they came here is that's not the way it was. The picture that you have up now, that would be another gentleman. That is August Gustav Hagmeyer.
And which one is he?
He is on the right.
Okay.
My right. He was, I also speak with his grandson, a gentleman named Martin. Me and Martin have been in contact since 2018, and we often check in with one another. But Gustav was actually born in 1924, and he was drafted. Yes, he was drafted in 1942, so he was only a kid when he was drafted into the military. The interesting thing about Gustav was actually wounded in battle in France, and he was left on the battlefield for dead. And a U.S. soldier happened upon him and took him to a hospital. And had him fixed up, healed. And then Gustav ended up going to a UK prisoner of war camp. And the interesting thing about that is that he spoke about the UK POW camp, and he said, we were so hungry, we would crawl through the sewers.
Wow.
To be able to go hunt rabbits because there was no food.
That was in the UK.
That was in the UK.
Wow.
That was in the UK.
We're going to hold it right there and come back for a third segment. Julie, this is some fascinating stuff. And we're going to talk about, in our final segment, the legacy of the POWs and the American way after this. Welcome back to this edition of History Through the Lens. I'm Tom Schaad, and we're talking about German POWs housed in Virginia and Hampton Roads during World War II. And I'm speaking with Julie Spivey, historian, who is joining us just in Mississippi. She used to work in Virginia Beach, and she did some really wonderful work here, some great research on the history of POWs in Virginia Beach, including Camp Ashby, which had a newspaper at their camp during World War II. And it was fascinating. The copy you sent me, I know we can pull it up here and have a look at it. It was written in German, and you were so gracious to give us a German translation to English. And I was quite taken by a few of the things that I read from guys who were fighting in North Africa against the Allies for Adolf Hitler. Okay, this is one quote. History has taught us and has shown us in recent days that nationalist movements have always failed and inevitably fail as soon as they cross the border that was drawn between them, the rule that no people can be master of another. This from a man who was fighting for the Nazis. That's incredible irony. What do you think of that?
That was one of my favorite things that I pulled out as well. When I was reading through the crude English translation, that was one of the things that I noted as well, is that here they are fighting for somebody that believes in all of that, enforces all of that, right. Yet you can see where their thought process is. They do not feel that way. They do not adhere to that kind of mindset, and their newspaper clearly shows that.
So, is it safe to say that maybe their stay here in America did it rub off on them in some way? The way their interactions with the citizenry, their stay at the camp, the fact that from what we know from all your research and from the research we've seen, they were treated humanely. Did it bring them around, or did they always have that in them, you think?
I believe that the influence that we had on them at the time was to show them that democracy was a better way. There were classes that the prisoners would go to that would teach them about the democratic way of life, and explain to them and show them the differences between how Germany is and how the United States was at the time. So I do believe that, honestly, I think they were seeing what we were showing them,
It's interesting.
which is,
No, no,
yeah,
no. Go ahead. Please finish. I'm sorry to cut you off.
it was just, which is that, ruling over is not the way. It's just not the way.
That individuals have power in many ways to build a better society versus the top
Right.
down. We build from the bottom up. Now, looking at this very, very crude newspaper, it's still a newspaper in a prison camp written by people who are enemies of the United States. I mean, I find that fascinating that they were even allowed to do that.
I was really shocked when I found out about the newspaper as well. But there was a checks and balances where the newspaper was concerned. It's not like they just freely wrote anything that they wanted. There was checks and balances because it is a POW camp. So
Sure.
I think the information in the newspaper is very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to read all of it. It came out to like 25 pages of translation, but I really was taken by some of those quotes about history and about individual freedom and about conquering people, and it seemed very cerebral, especially. So I just wonder. Again, this was always in them. And there was a re-education camp on the Eastern Shore at Fort Eustis, right? They were taught I think just after the war, right, about the democracy and about all the freedoms we enjoy and the free world. These guys learned from what they saw in the camps or society at large in America. I mean, what was their takeaway, basically?
I do believe that they learned what they saw, and I think that the way that we treated them was a big part of that. And then the re-education program just kind of reinforced what we were trying to show them. It was the re-education program was big. It was throughout all of the POW camps, and it taught them, that, like you said before, individual freedom, individual thought. It is not a bad thing to have individual freedom and individual thought. And there is different ways to be able to achieve, authority, but through democratic means.
Exactly, without conquering other people. And
That's right.
No, this has been fascinating, just incredible. A lot of people still can't believe that we had POWs from Germany right here in Virginia Beach and on the Eastern Shore. Just one quick story before we go. We're almost running out of time. But I remember reading an article in one of the Eastern Shore newspapers from the 1940s that 2 prisoners of war actually escaped. And they went over the barbed wire, and 2 citizens found them, and they were very meek and very humble when they brought them back. It's kind of like not the typical idea you would have of, when you look at the movies, say the Nazis, we're fighting the Nazis, and yet we're seeing a lot of common humanities between, the 2 cultures that really have nothing to do with ideology or governments.
That's right. And there are several stories of prisoners escaping, and I and this is not fact. This is definitely, I've not found fact on this, but I did hear rumor of 3 prisoners breaking out because they wanted to go have a cold beer and meet a nice woman. And then they
Gee,
return
that's a
themselves.
shock.
Yeah, then they basically return themselves to the camp.
Oh, my.
So, you hear stories all the time about these prisoners, but I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is the way they spoke about it after the fact, which is they were fed, they were taken care of, they learned things, they saw new things, they saw a whole new world that they didn't even know existed here in the United States. And they were so well taken care of that their family members would try to send them care packages and they would send them back home. They didn't even accept them.
Wow. Even the food in prison and the things they got here were better according to, what they were used to.
Yeah. There is a report from one prisoner that said, we have so much food here. We have never eaten this many times in a day. So
That's incredible. From prisoner of war camp, we're talking about. Okay, it goes
yes.
against a lot of Hollywood type, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes. Well, definitely on the United States side of things. I
Exactly.
agree.
We haven't really, talked too much about German prisoners of war being held in the U.S. So this is kind of a new ground that's been broken over the last several years, and you've been a part of that. And Julie Spivey, I want to thank you for coming on History Through the Lens and just telling everybody else, remember, we make history every day.